So this is our second lecture of digestion. We just talked about the small intestine. Now we're going to talk about chemical digestion and absorption, and then move on into the large intestine. Um, we've already talked about these mostly before, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. You guys will have to read the book and really try to learn everything yourselves. Yeah. So. We talked about carbohydrates, and starch is the most digestible dietary carbohydrate, with cellulose also being a carbohydrate, being indigestible by humans, and this is what fiber is. So think of undigested corn or something like that. Um, and so I don't really care that you guys learn what starch is first digested into. So you don't need to know this oligosaccharides part. All I really want you to know is that starch or carbohydrates eventually becomes glucose, and glucose is what is absorbed by the small intestine. So we talked about this with carbohydrates. The process begins in the mouth with salivary amylase. And with this, I don't care that you know that salivary amylase hydrolyzes starch into oligosaccharides. All I want you to know is that salivary amylase is associated with carbohydrate digestion and begins in the mouth. So as soon as amylase is swallowed into the stomach, it begins to stop working or is denatured. And because of the stomach acid, and then because it's an enzyme, it's then digested by pepsin. So most of dietary starch is digested before it reaches the small intestine by salivary amylase, okay? So it stops digesting until it goes into the small intestine, when it's then digested by pancreatic amylase, which is resuming starch digestion in the intestine. If you remember, there's that sphincter, so the duodenum receives pancreatic juices that include the pancreatic enzymes. So pancreatic amylase takes over in the small intestine, and then brush border enzymes finish the carbohydrate digestion. If you need to review what brush border enzymes are, look at the previous video. So from there, glucose is then absorbed into the bloodstream in the small intestine and is absorbed by the blood capillaries, and then goes through the hepatic portal system into the liver. So proteins become amino acids, and they are absorbed by the small intestine, and they come from 3 different sources. So of course, dietary proteins, and then digestive enzymes digested by each other. So if you remember that pepsin will degrade salivary amylase, and then also the sloughed off epithelial cells that are digested by enzymes. So proteases are the broad class of enzymes that degrade proteins, and these are also sometimes called peptidases. So the first one begins its work in the stomach at a pretty low acidic pH, and this is pepsin. So then it continues in the small intestine. So pepsin is inactivated when it passes into the duodenum and mixes with alkaline pancreatic juice, as well as the bicarbonate mucus. And then pancreatic enzymes of trypsin and chymotrypsin take over the process, with the brush border enzymes finishing the task, producing free amino acids that are then absorbed into the intestinal epithelial cells. So lipids are harder to digest because of the hydrophobicity of lipids, making their digestion and absorption complicated. So lipases are the fat digesting enzymes, and this begins with lingual lipase, which is secreted by the tongue, and this is active in the mouth, becomes more active in the stomach along with the gastric lipase. So before it goes into the duodenum, the vigorous pumping in the stomach emulsifies the fat or breaks up globs. So when we said hydrophobicity here, think about mixing water with oil, and how it's hydrophobic, meaning the oil's afraid of water. So now think about if you were to shake, if you put this in like a water bottle, if you were to shake it up, it would break it up into globs, and this is what's called emulsification. So these emulsification droplets are then passed into the small intestine. So those droplets are then going to be broken down further into bile, lecthin, and agitation, just pure agitation, further shaking it up by that intestinal segmentation. And this exposes more fat to the surface so that enzymes can work on it. So lipase will act on triglycerides, which are one of the the broken down parts of lipids. So the stomach is going to, or I'm sorry, the small intestine is going to absorb free fatty acids as well as monoglycerides. And the absorption depends on micelles. Look up in your book, you'll have to look up in your book to see how these micelles work for further explanation on that. So these micelles pass down the bile duct and end up in the duodenum, where they're going to absorb fat-soluble vitamins as well as cholesterol and free fatty acids and monoglycerides that are produced by fat digestion. And they function to transport lipids into the intestinal absorptive cells, where the lipids are going to leave the micelles and diffuse through the plasma membrane into those cells where they can be absorbed and used by the body. So look over and know this summary of nutrient digestion. What I want you to know is where it occurs. I don't care that you know what, say, salivary amylase. I don't care that you know that it breaks it down into oligosaccharides and maltose, but know that it works on carbohydrates and where it is. So nucleic acid, although this isn't a macronutrient, nucleic acid is broken down by nucleases that are within the brush border. And nucleases, which are in DNA and RNA, are what breaks them down. And DNA, RNA with nucleic acid, those are reused by the body. So definitely remember that. So most vitamins are absorbed unchanged. And there are fat-soluble vitamins versus water-soluble vitamins, which have different diffusion rates and different absorptions. So minerals are electrolytes, and this would be things such as calcium, iron, sodium, potassium, things like that. We talked about parathyroid hormone, or PTH, or parathormone, and this is secreted by the parathyroids in response to a drop in blood calcium. And this is going to stimulate the synthesis of vitamin D in the kidney so that parathyroid hormone will eventually increase the level of calcium in the blood. So water is absorbed mostly in the small intestine, but also in the large intestine. And diarrhea will occur when the large intestine absorbs too little water, so that means that feces is going to pass through too quickly, or if it contains high concentrations of a solute. Constipation, on the other hand, occurs when fecal movement is slow and too much water is reabsorbed by the large intestine so that feces becomes hardened. So we'll start talking about the large intestine here and talk about defecation. Again, definitely look at your book for more explanation. So the large intestine receives about 500 milliliters of indigestible residue per day, and its function is to reduce it, basically compact it into feces, and then eliminate that feces via defecation. So remember we talked about the ileocecal junction. So this is where the large intestine is going to start, and it begins as the cecum, with the appendix attached at the lower end of the cecum. We've heard, I'm sure, before that the appendix has no function. It actually does have a large function with immunity, and it's densely populated with lymphocytes, which are immune cells. It also has a lot of your resident gut microbiota. So the large intestine is divided into the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. There's then the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. So the muscularis externa of the colon is unusual, and this is because of the Taenia coli, the hostra, and the internal and external anal sphincters. So I want you to know all of these parts. So we talked about the ileum and the cecum joining here. Here's the appendix. So here's the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon. You can kind of see that it's S-shaped, the rectum, and the anal canal. So just like the small intestine, the large intestine is served by mesenteric arteries and veins, so that the superior mesenteric artery branches fan out and supply the ascending and transverse colon with blood, whereas the inferior mesenteric artery supplies the rest of the transverse colon as well as the rest of the colon. So the veins also follow the same pattern as the artery, and they eventually drain into the hepatic portal system. So the mucosa of the large intestine, what's notable is the anal canal has non-keratinized epithelium for abrasion resistance. There are also no circular folds or villi in the large intestine, but they do have intestinal crypts. Additionally, there's a lot of lymphatic tissue within the large intestine. And this is to help with the protection from the large population of bacteria within the large intestine. We talked about gut microbiota, and this plays a huge role in our health and digestion. So speaking of that gut microbiome, we have about 800, but probably even more species of bacteria within your large intestine. And these bacteria are mostly our friends, and they help with digesting cellulose, pectin, and other carbohydrates that we can't digest ourselves, including lactose. So they also help in the synthesis of vitamins B and K, but they produce an unfortunate side effect of flatus, which is intestinal gas. Most of farts is intestinal air, but bacteria add to it, and they produce the smells that we think of when we think about farts. And these are mostly due to hydrogen sulfide, indole, and scatol. Scatol is, we've talked about before, and that's what's mostly responsible for the odor that we associate with feces and farts. So the large intestine takes about 36 to 48 hours to reduce the residue of a meal to feces, so most of that time is spent within the transverse colon. Remember that the large intestine does not chemically change the residue. It only compacts it. Most of feces is water with a little bit of solids, with most of those solids being bacteria or undigested fiber, and very little bit being the mucus, protein, salt, digestive secretions, epithelial cells, and so forth. So defecation, the stretching of the rectum is going to stimulate defecation reflexes, and this accounts for the urge to defecate right after you eat. And this is due to two different reflexes, which are the intrinsic defecation reflex and the parasympathetic defecation reflex that involves the spinal cord. So here we can see the patterns of the neural control of defecation. We will talk about this a little bit more when we have our review, but definitely remember to come to the review prepared, and we will have a quiz on Tuesday. All right, bye.